In the quiet, upscale neighborhood of Highland Oaks, the Halburn family was the picture of success and stability. But beneath their polished facade lay secrets dark enough to shatter lives. When a respected patriarch meets a sudden, tragic end, a tangled web of betrayal and deception begins to unravel, revealing the lengths people will go to protect pride, desire, and revenge. What followed was a scandal that would haunt the community and forever stain the Halper name. Highland Oaks was a beautiful, quiet neighborhood. The lawns were perfectly trimmed, trees lined the streets, and each house looked grand and well kept. The people who lived here were proud of their homes and their place in the community. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone seemed to have it all together. The Halperns fit right in. Their house sat at the end of a peaceful street, surrounded by neat flower beds and bushes that looked like they were trimmed every day. Everything about the house seemed planned out, down to the smallest detail, just like Jeremy Halpern himself. As an architectural consultant, he was known for his careful planning and love for order. Jeremy was tall, with neatly styled hair and a sharp look in his eyes. To the neighbors, he seemed like a man who had everything under control, but those who knew him better sensed a strict, even cold side to him. From a young age, Jeremy liked things to be in order. People who knew him as a child told stories of how he would arrange his toys and organize his books perfectly, never letting anything fall out of place. This love for order helped him succeed in his job. But at home, it sometimes felt a bit too strict. His wife, Nadia, saw this side of him all too often. Nadia Halburn was 27 and had recently left her job as a teacher. She was warm and friendly, with a smile that could charm anyone. While she enjoyed meeting the neighbors and helping at the local church, she often felt trapped in her new life. Jeremy's need for control left her feeling more like an accessory in his well-organized life than a true partner. Each day started the same way. Coffee on the back porch, chores around the house, and then quiet evenings with Jeremy. The neighbors thought she was happy, but inside, Nadia longed for more. The most interesting person in the Halpern family was Jeremy's father, Oliver Halpern. At 60, Oliver was a successful attorney, known for his confidence and ability to charm anyone he met. He was tall and strong, with a friendly smile and sharp blue eyes that drew people in. Oliver could make anyone feel comfortable. While Jeremy kept to himself, Oliver enjoyed talking to people and always seemed at ease. For Nadia, Oliver's warm personality was refreshing. His kindness made her feel seen and valued, and she found herself wanting to spend more time with him. Whenever she was around him, she felt a bit more alive, a bit more like herself, as if she were stepping out of Jeremy's tightly controlled world, even if only for a moment. While Oliver's charm delighted Nadia, it quietly worried Jeremy. He respected his father but felt uncomfortable with the influence Oliver had. Jeremy had always admired his father, but there was something about his charm and authority that made him wary. Oliver could easily control a room with his confidence, and Jeremy had felt that power for as long as he could remember. In this family, everyone seemed to play a part. Jeremy was the orderly husband, Nadia the supportive wife, and Oliver the charming elder. But beneath their perfect appearances, small cracks were forming. There were hints of tension, little signs that all was not as smooth as it seemed. These hidden feelings would soon lead to something much darker, threatening the family's carefully built life. Before we dive deeper into this tragic and haunting case, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to light. Now, let's get back to the story. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Nadia Halpern sat with her coffee, staring out at the quiet backyard. Every day had started like this since she'd left her teaching job, a warm cup of coffee, the silence of the morning, and the feeling of emptiness she couldn't shake. On the outside, her life seemed peaceful and calm, but inside, Nadia felt trapped. Jeremy, her husband, wanted everything in its place. He liked routines and order, and he expected Nadia to follow along. At first, she thought she could do it. She enjoyed making their home comfortable, organizing the kitchen, and tending to the small garden outside. But as time went on, Her days started feeling like they belonged to someone else. She was just playing a part, moving through each day without really feeling it. Nadia had once been a teacher, and she missed the energy and connection of her students. She missed having purpose, something to look forward to. Jeremy didn't seem to understand this. To him, her role at home was enough. It's simple, predictable, he'd told her once, as if that was supposed to make her happy. But simple and predictable felt more like a cage than a blessing. One Sunday, the Halburns had a family dinner, something they did every week. Nadia's mind drifted as she watched her husband, his eyes scanning the table, making sure everything was perfect. But when her gaze shifted to Oliver Halburn, her father-in-law, she felt a small spark of excitement. Oliver was different from Jeremy. Where Jeremy was quiet and serious, Oliver was warm and full of life. As the evening went on, Nadia found herself drawn to Oliver's conversation. He talked about his latest case with humor and excitement, his voice filling the room. She laughed at his jokes, something she hadn't done in a long time. When he spoke, it was like he brought color back into her world. While Jeremy preferred to keep his distance, Oliver pulled people in, making them feel important, even in the smallest moments. After dinner, as the others left the table, Oliver stayed behind with Nadia. They talked casually at first about the food and the weather. But soon, the conversation shifted. Oliver asked her how she was feeling, a simple question, but one Jeremy rarely asked. She felt like he truly wanted to know. She found herself telling him things she hadn't shared with anyone, how she missed teaching, how her days felt empty, and how hard it was to feel seen. Oliver listened with a warmth and attentiveness that surprised her. He didn't rush her, didn't judge her. Instead, he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It sounds like you need something more," he said softly. His words hit her deeply. As if he could see the loneliness she tried so hard to hide. For the first time in a long time, Nadia felt understood. That evening, as she got ready for bed, Nadia thought about Oliver's kindness. She knew he was just being supportive, but his warmth stayed with her, lingering in her thoughts like a soft, comforting glow. In the quiet moments, she wondered if he saw her in a way Jeremy never had. And as she drifted off to sleep, she realized she was already looking forward to their next family dinner. Another Sunday evening arrived, bringing with it the usual family dinner. The table was set perfectly, and Jeremy, as always, seemed to be watching everything, making sure every little detail was right. He barely looked up as he ate, his focus entirely on the food and the way everything was arranged. Nadia, though, couldn't help but notice Oliver. There was something comforting and exciting about being around him. His laughter filled the room, his stories were lively, and he always looked at her in a way that made her feel seen. The connection she felt with him was becoming harder to ignore. As the evening went on, Nadia felt herself drawn to Oliver more and more. His presence was like a warm light in her otherwise routine life, something that brought her a sense of relief from the stiffness of her daily life with Jeremy. She couldn't explain it. But whenever she looked at Oliver, she felt a thrill that she hadn't felt in years. When dinner was over, Jeremy left the table, distracted by something he needed to check in his study. Nadia stayed behind, helping clear the dishes, and soon it was just her and Oliver in the dining room. The quietness between them felt thick, filled with a kind of tension she hadn't felt before. Oliver glanced at her, his expression soft. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Nadia hesitated but then nodded, though her heart was beating fast. "Yes," she replied, trying to sound calm, but even she could hear the slight shake in her voice. Oliver reached over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was simple, but it made her feel a rush of warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Her heart pounded as she looked into his eyes, realizing how close they were, how easy it would be to give in to the emotions building inside her. She knew it was wrong, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The world seemed to slow down, and all she could feel was Oliver's hand on her shoulder, his warmth seeping into her, making her forget about everything else. She didn't pull away, and neither did he. They stayed there for a moment that felt like forever, locked in a silent understanding of what was happening between them. When the moment finally broke, Nadia stepped back, her cheeks warm, a mix of guilt and excitement washing over her. Oliver's hand dropped, but the spark between them lingered in the air, as real as if they'd spoken it aloud. She knew this was the start of something she couldn't ignore, something that would change everything. Before we forge ahead, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for the next part, where things get even more complicated. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Jeremy Halburn sat alone in his study, the light from his desk lamp casting shadows across the room. This was his favorite place in the house, a space he could control completely. Every book was in its place, every paper neatly stacked. But tonight, his mind wasn't on his work. His thoughts were elsewhere, and they kept circling back to Nadia. Lately, something about her had changed. Jeremy had always been observant, noticing the smallest details in everything around him, and now he couldn't ignore the little shifts in his wife's behavior. She seemed distracted, and while she smiled and did everything as usual, there was something different about her. He thought back to a few weeks ago when he'd first noticed a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on her. It wasn't the one she usually wore, and when he'd asked her about it, she'd brushed it off with a light laugh, saying she was trying something new. But something about it didn't sit right with him. Then, there were the moments he'd catch her glancing at her phone, as if she were waiting for a message. Sometimes, she would leave the room to answer a call, saying it was a friend or an old coworker, but the vague explanations started to add up in his mind. And recently, she'd seemed nervous, looking over her shoulder or quickly putting away her phone when he walked in. Jeremy's gaze hardened as he stared at the wall, his mind working through these small details. To anyone else, these things might have seemed innocent, just little changes in routine. But to Jeremy, these small changes were like puzzle pieces, each one revealing a picture he didn't like. He knew his wife well enough to sense when something was wrong. In his mind, her actions painted a troubling image, a sign that she was hiding something. But Jeremy wasn't one to act out of emotion. He was a man of control, a man who thought things through carefully. So instead of confronting her, he decided to watch quietly, letting her believe he hadn't noticed anything. He would find out the truth, but he would do it in his own way, carefully and without tipping her off. Jeremy's need for order and control wouldn't let him settle for anything less. For now, he would wait. But in his mind, a plan was already starting to form. If you're intrigued by this unfolding story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We have more twists coming, so stay tuned and share your thoughts in the comments. Nadia's heart raced as she parked her car in a quiet spot far from home. She checked the time and then looked around, making sure nobody was watching. It was a risky meeting like this, but the thrill and excitement made it impossible to resist. She stepped out of the car, feeling both anxious and eager, and walked towards the small cafe where she knew Oliver would be waiting. Inside, Oliver sat at a corner table, his face lighting up when he saw her. They'd chosen this cafe far from their usual area, so they wouldn't run into anyone they knew. They even used prepaid phones to plan their meetings, leaving nothing to chance. Every part of their relationship was wrapped in secrecy, from the hidden messages to the quiet, out-of-the-way places where they met. When Nadia sat down, she felt the thrill of being close to him again. It was like they were in their own world, away from the rules and routines that usually controlled her life. Oliver's voice was warm and soothing, and she loved the way he looked at her, making her feel like the center of his attention. They talked about small things at first, sharing stories and laughter, but as time went on, their conversations grew deeper. Oliver listened to her in a way that made her feel truly understood, something she rarely felt with Jeremy. With him, she didn't have to pretend to be the perfect wife or follow the strict routines Jeremy expected. With Oliver, she could be herself, and that freedom made her feel alive. But even in these moments of joy, there was a shadow of fear. Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that someone might notice, that Jeremy might somehow find out. She thought of his sharp eyes, how he seemed to notice even the smallest details, and it sent a chill down her spine. Sometimes, she imagined him catching her and Oliver together, and the thought made her heart pound with a mix of fear and excitement. Their time together passed quickly, and soon it was time to leave. Nadia checked her phone, making sure there were no messages from Jeremy, before glancing at Oliver one last time. "I hate leaving," she whispered. Oliver reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know," he said softly, his eyes filled with warmth. "But we have to be careful." Nadia nodded, understanding the risks, but unable to let go of the connection they shared. Every time they parted, she felt the weight of the secret growing heavier, and yet she kept coming back, drawn to the excitement and the sense of freedom she felt with Oliver. As they walked out separately, Nadia felt a strange mix of emotions, happiness, fear, and guilt, all tangled together. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but the thrill of it kept her going. For now, their secret was safe, but she couldn't help wondering how long they could keep it hidden. Jeremy sat in a small, dimly lit office, the kind of place that most people didn't even notice on the street. Across from him sat Calvin Ross, a private investigator with a quiet, serious look about him. Calvin was known for being discreet and thorough, the type of man who could find out almost anything without drawing attention. Jeremy had come here with a clear purpose. His suspicions about Nadia had grown too strong to ignore, and he was tired of wondering. He needed answers, and he needed them without alerting her. As Calvin listened, Jeremy laid out the situation in his usual calm, controlled way. He didn't show any anger or hurt, only a cold determination. "I need to know where she goes, who she sees," he said, his voice steady. "I don't want her to know she's being watched." Calvin nodded, his face unreadable. He'd handled cases like this before, but something about Jeremy's calmness felt unusual. Most people in his situation would show some emotion, but Jeremy seemed entirely focused, like he was discussing a business deal. "I understand," Calvin replied. "I'll be discreet. You'll get what you need." Jeremy handed him a recent photo of Nadia, along with a few details about her usual routines. "She's been different lately," Jeremy explained, keeping his voice steady. "Taking calls in private, leaving the house at odd times. I want to know why." Calvin nodded again, taking the information and making mental notes. He was used to dealing with clients who felt betrayed, but Jeremy's lack of emotion gave him an odd feeling. There was something intense, almost chilling, about the way Jeremy spoke, as if he had already decided what he would do with the information. "Your job is to follow her without her knowing," Jeremy continued. "Photos, records of her movements. I want proof." Calvin understood. He took the assignment, his mind already going through the steps he'd need to follow. But as he glanced up at Jeremy, he couldn't shake the sense that this case would be different, that there was something darker lurking behind the man's calm demeanor. Jeremy got up to leave, giving Calvin a firm handshake. "I'll expect updates," he said simply, his face still expressionless. As he walked out of the office, Calvin watched him go, a slight unease settling over him. He had a feeling that whatever he found would lead to something much bigger, and perhaps much more dangerous than he had anticipated. Jeremy sat alone in his home office, his hands resting on a thick envelope that Calvin, the private investigator, had dropped off earlier. The envelope was heavy, filled with photos, documents, and notes, evidence of what he already feared. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened it, each movement calm and controlled. Inside were photos of Nadia with Oliver. Jeremy's eyes narrowed as he studied each one, his face growing colder with every picture. There were shots of them meeting in quiet cafes, walking side by side, and laughing in a way that was too familiar. He saw the look in Nadia's eyes, a happiness he hadn't seen in a long time, but it wasn't directed at him. It was for his own father. Jeremy clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edges of the photos tightly. He flipped through more evidence, a copy of a hotel receipt, a list of phone calls, and notes from Calvin about times and places they'd met. The more he read, the clearer the betrayal became. It was undeniable. A wave of anger surged inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, his face unreadable. He wouldn't allow himself to lose control, not now. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was the time to think, to plan. Jeremy's mind began working through the facts like pieces in a puzzle, fitting them together in a way that made sense to him. Nadia and Oliver had both crossed a line, one that could not be forgiven. As he sat there, his hurt and anger turned into something colder, something darker. The betrayal wasn't just a personal wound, it was an attack on his sense of order, on the stability he had built around him. Jeremy realized he needed more than just understanding. He needed action. There was a wrong that needed to be righted, a betrayal that needed a consequence. He looked over the evidence one last time, his expression hardening into quiet resolve. He would do something about this, but he wouldn't confront Nadia or Oliver openly. Instead, he would make a plan, one that would restore the control he felt he had lost. Jeremy wasn't interested in simple revenge. He wanted to be sure this betrayal was paid for in full. Carefully, he gathered the photos, receipts, and notes, putting them back in the envelope. His mind was already forming ideas, calculating each step with the same precision he used in his work. As he sat in the silence of his study, Jeremy felt an unsettling calm. This was no longer about sadness or even anger. It was about reclaiming his life, his control, and his dignity. Nadia's day started like any other. She drove to the grocery store, her mind racing as she mentally checked off her list. But today, there was something else bothering her, a heavy feeling she couldn't quite shake. As she walked through the store, picking out items one by one, she felt a strange sense of unease, like someone was watching her. She glanced around, scanning the aisles, but saw only strangers focused on their shopping. Yet, the feeling lingered, a quiet pressure pressing on her as she went about her errands. Back at home, things felt even more unsettling. She could feel Jeremy's eyes on her, watching her in a way he never had before. His gaze was calm, as always, but there was a new intensity to it, a quiet weight that made her feel exposed. Every time she looked up, she caught him glancing her way, his face unreadable, and it sent a chill down her spine. She tried to ignore it, acting as if everything was fine, but her nerves were starting to fray. Her hands shook a little as she sorted through the groceries, each small movement feeling painfully obvious. She wondered if he knew, if somehow he had found out about her secret meetings with Oliver. But every time she started to panic, she forced herself to breathe, telling herself that it was all in her head. At night, she could barely sleep, her mind running through 1,000 what-ifs. What if Jeremy had seen something? What if he was just waiting for the right moment to confront her? She imagined him going through her phone, watching her every move, and the thought made her heart pound with fear. When she saw Oliver, she told him about her growing worries, but he brushed it off, telling her she was just being paranoid. Jeremy's always been a little distant, hasn't he? He'd said, smiling as if it was nothing. But his words didn't calm her. In fact, they only made her feel more alone. Every time she stepped out of the house, she felt a rush of anxiety, looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone was following her. Her once thrilling meetings with Oliver were now shadowed by fear. She felt her phone buzzing in her pocket, each message making her jump, afraid it might be Jeremy asking questions she didn't have answers to. As days passed, the stress began to take its toll. Nadia was losing sleep, barely able to focus on the small tasks she'd once done without thinking. Her mind was constantly running, waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. But she couldn't stop. Despite the fear, despite the growing sense that Jeremy knew more than he let on, she couldn't let go of the one part of her life that made her feel free. So, she went on pretending everything was fine, all while feeling the invisible net closing in around her. If you're feeling the tension, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more. Let us know in the comments how you think Nadia's story will unfold from here. Jeremy sat in a dark corner of a quiet bar, his fingers wrapped around a glass that he hadn't touched. He waited patiently, his face calm, his eyes focused on the door. After a few minutes, Calvin Ross, the private investigator, walked in and spotted him. Calvin made his way over, sliding into the seat across from Jeremy. They exchanged a few words of small talk, but Jeremy wasn't here to waste time. His voice was calm and low as he got to the point. "I need another job done," he said, his expression unreadable. Calvin's brow furrowed slightly. "I thought you just wanted the information," he replied, unsure of what Jeremy was asking for now. Jeremy took a deep breath, looking straight at Calvin. "I want it taken care of." Quietly, without suspicion, Calvin's eyes widened a bit as he began to understand what Jeremy was saying. This wasn't about more surveillance or information. Jeremy wanted something far more final. He wanted Oliver gone for good. For a moment, Calvin hesitated, realizing the seriousness of the request. This was more than just a job. It was something that could change lives, and not in a good way. But Jeremy's calm, steady gaze didn't waver. "I need it to look like an accident," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "Something clean, something no one will question." Calvin felt a chill run down his spine. He'd handled tough cases before, but this was different. The way Jeremy spoke, with that calm determination, made it clear he was serious. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet, unsettling focus that left no room for argument. "Jeremy, are you sure about this?" Calvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Jeremy replied simply. "It has to be done. I'm willing to pay whatever it takes. I just need you to handle it without leaving a trace." Calvin looked down, thinking it over, feeling the weight of the choice he was being asked to make. He knew this was dangerous, that once he agreed, there would be no turning back. But the offer was tempting, and Jeremy's resolve was undeniable. After a long pause, Calvin finally nodded, his face grim. "All right," he said, his voice low. "But it has to be perfect. No mistakes, no loose ends." Jeremy's face remained calm, but a hint of satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "That's exactly what I want," he replied. "I'll leave the details to you." As Calvin left the bar, a heavy feeling settled over him. He couldn't shake the sense that he was about to cross a line he'd never crossed before. But Jeremy's instructions were clear, and the payment would be enough to make the risk worth it, or so he hoped. Jeremy stayed behind, watching as Calvin disappeared into the night. His mind was steady, his plan set. He would regain control, no matter the cost. The lake house sat quietly on the edge of a still, dark lake, surrounded by trees that blocked out most of the outside world. It was Oliver's retreat, a place where he often went to escape the pressures of his work and life. He enjoyed the peace there, a welcome change from the busyness of his daily life. That morning, Oliver had agreed to meet Calvin at the lake house. Calvin had told him he needed advice on a legal matter, something Oliver was happy to help with. There was no reason for Oliver to suspect anything unusual. He welcomed Calvin warmly, and they spoke for a while in the cozy living room, sipping coffee and chatting casually. After a while, Calvin suggested they take a walk by the lake. It was a beautiful, crisp day, and the lake was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Oliver agreed, grabbing his coat as they stepped outside. As they walked along the narrow path by the water, Calvin kept his tone light, chatting about nothing in particular. But his mind was racing, every step bringing him closer to the moment he dreaded but had agreed to carry out. He glanced at Oliver, who seemed relaxed, enjoying the fresh air. It was clear Oliver trusted him completely. They reached a spot where the path was rougher, a rocky ledge that jutted out over the lake. Calvin stopped, pretending to admire the view, his heart pounding as he braced himself. The area was secluded. There would be no witnesses, no one to see what happened next. With a quick, controlled movement, Calvin pushed Oliver toward the edge. Caught off guard, Oliver stumbled, losing his footing on the slippery rocks. His arms flailed as he tried to catch himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The moment seemed to stretch out in silence, and then, in an instant, Oliver fell over the ledge, tumbling down the rocky slope and landing hard at the water's edge. Calvin didn't move. He stood there, breathing heavily, watching as the realization set in. The fall had been brutal, and there was no question that Oliver hadn't survived. The stillness of the lake seemed even heavier now, as if it were absorbing the shock of what had just happened. After a moment, Calvin carefully retraced his steps, leaving no trace of his presence. He took a final look back at the scene, making sure everything looked as if Oliver had simply lost his balance and fallen. There was nothing unusual, nothing that would raise suspicion. It was done. Calvin drove away from the lake house in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. He tried to push the memory of what he'd done out of his mind, but the image of Oliver's fall replayed again and again. The act was complete, but the weight of it stayed with him, a silent reminder of the line he'd crossed. When the authorities found Oliver's body, it was ruled a tragic accident. They saw no signs of foul play, only a slip on the rocky path that had led to an unfortunate fall. Jeremy's plan had worked perfectly. Oliver was gone, and no one suspected a thing. Detective Diana Harper stood by the water, staring out at the spot where Oliver Halpern's body had been found. The lake was calm now, peaceful even, but something about the scene felt wrong. She had been called in after Oliver's death was ruled an accident, but as she looked around, her instincts told her there was more to the story. Harper had been a detective for years, and over time, she had developed an ability to sense when things didn't add up. Oliver's fall didn't make sense to her. The area where his body had been discovered was rugged, but it wasn't particularly dangerous. The path was well known to locals, and accidents didn't happen here often. But something about the way he'd fallen felt too clean, too perfect for an accident. She had already reviewed the details of the case, the reports from the officers who had been first on the scene, the statements from witnesses who had seen Oliver the day before. Everything seemed straightforward at first, but the more Harper thought about it, the more questions she had. Why had Oliver been so far out at the lake house alone? Why had he been there at all without any sign of a struggle or reason for his fall? Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. She turned to see a group of local officers walking toward her, one of them holding a file. "Detective Harper," the officer said, handing her the file. "We've gathered everything we could. There's nothing in the autopsy report to suggest foul play, but something doesn't feel right." Harper finished, glancing down at the file. She flipped through it quickly, her eyes scanning the notes, the photos, the details of Oliver's life. As she read, she noticed a pattern in the statements that gave her pause. Several people mentioned Oliver had been acting unusually distant lately, but no one could explain why. Harper took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the case settle in. She had learned long ago to trust her gut, and right now, her gut was telling her there was something bigger happening here than just an unfortunate accident. "Check his financial records," Harper instructed, handing the file back to the officer. "I want to know if there's any reason Oliver would have gone out there alone, any connections we missed, and start looking into his family, especially his son, Jeremy Halburn. I'm going to take a closer look at the people closest to him." As the officer nodded and walked off to follow her instructions, Harper remained by the water, deep in thought. She could feel the case pulling her in, and she knew it was just the beginning. The more she uncovered, the more likely it was that this wasn't the accident it appeared to be. Someone was hiding something, and Harper was determined to find out what. If you're enjoying the mystery so far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments what you think Harper will discover as the investigation continues. It was a quiet afternoon when Detective Diana Harper walked up to the front door of the Halburn house. The air felt thick with tension, and Harper could almost sense the secrets that lay hidden within these walls. She had already spoken to the neighbors, looked over Oliver's history, and gathered enough to know that this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. Now it was time to talk to Nadia. The door opened slowly, and Nadia Halburn greeted Harper with a nervous smile. "Detective Harper," she said softly. "I wasn't expecting you." Harper stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning the room. It looked like any other family home, clean, orderly, nothing out of place. But there was an uneasiness in the air, something about the way Nadia stood that made Harper feel like she was being watched. The tension in Nadia's posture was hard to miss. She was trying to act calm, but Harper could see through it. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Halburn," Harper began, keeping her tone gentle. "I just need to ask a few questions about your father-in-law. It's standard procedure." Nadia nodded quickly, biting her lip. "Of course, anything I can do to help." Harper sat down across from Nadia, her eyes studying the younger woman carefully. She had read through Nadia's statements and seen the signs of nervousness. There was something in Nadia's eyes, a hint of worry, maybe even fear, that made Harper suspicious. "Can you tell me what you were doing when your father-in-law passed away?" Harper asked, her voice steady but probing. Nadia shifted in her seat, her hands wringing together in her lap. I was at home. I didn't even know Oliver was at the lake house. I never thought something like this would happen." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped away a tear. Harper watched her closely, noticing how Nadia's eyes darted to the side for a moment before she quickly met her gaze again. It was a small thing, But Harper had seen enough to know it meant something. Nadia was hiding something, and it wasn't just grief. Did Oliver ever mention anything unusual to you recently? Anything that might explain why he was out there alone? Harper pressed, trying to catch her off guard. Nadia hesitated, her eyes looking down at her hands. No, she said quickly. I didn't know he was going out there. He never said anything. He was fine the last time we spoke. It was just so sudden. Harper leaned forward slightly. She could feel the weight of the silence between them. Nadia's answer didn't sit right. The way she was avoiding certain questions made Harper more certain there was something Nadia wasn't saying. She had to keep pressing. Your husband, Jeremy, Harper began, watching Nadia's reaction carefully. Has he been acting differently since Oliver's death? I know this has been hard on your family. Nadia's breath caught her throat, and she looked away, her face tightening. Jeremy's fine. He's just upset. It's been hard on all of us, but we'll get through it. Harper didn't buy it. There was more to this than Nadia was letting on, but she couldn't force the answers out of her. Not yet anyway. Instead, she sat back, studying Nadia's expression. I'll need to speak with your husband next, Harper said calmly. But I appreciate your time, Mrs. Halburn. If you remember anything that could help, please don't hesitate to reach out. Nadia nodded, a little too quickly. Of course, detective. Thank you. As Harper stood and walked toward the door, she could feel Nadia's eyes following her. But Nadia didn't say anything more. The door closed softly behind her as Harper stepped back out into the cool afternoon air. She was certain now. Something was off with the Halburns, and it wasn't just Oliver's death. Harper didn't know exactly what it was yet, but she was going to find out. Calvin Ross sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. The silence around him felt thick, heavy. He couldn't stop thinking about the day he had pushed Oliver over the edge of the cliff, watching as the man fell, lifeless, into the rocks below. The memory of it wouldn't leave him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Oliver's body lying at the water's edge. He had taken the money. He had done what Jeremy asked, but the guilt was gnawing at him now. The pay had been good, but no amount of money could take away the image of what he had done. The fall, the silence afterward, the cold realization that Oliver was dead, all of it was more than he could handle. Calvin knew what he had to do. He couldn't live with this guilt anymore. He couldn't pretend like nothing had happened. Jeremy had made it clear that everything needed to stay quiet, that the death had to look like an accident. But Calvin couldn't ignore the fact that someone needed to know the truth. Someone had to see through the lie, and that someone was Detective Harper. Sitting at his desk, Calvin picked up a pen and hesitated for a moment. His fingers trembled as he wrote a short, anonymous letter. He didn't sign it, didn't give any clue to his identity, but the words were enough. I know who did it. The letter began. Jeremy Halburn asked me to make it look like an accident. I can't live with myself anymore. You need to look into him. Oliver's death wasn't what it seemed. Calvin's heart raced as he sealed the letter, unsure of what would happen once it was sent. The truth was now in someone else's hands, but he didn't feel relieved. Instead, he felt exposed, like he was putting himself at risk by admitting what he'd done, even if he hadn't put his name on it. He grabbed an envelope, slid the letter inside, and addressed it to Detective Harper at the police station. He thought about burning it, about pretending he had never written it, but he couldn't do that. He had to do something to make up for the role he played in Oliver's death. He couldn't keep living like this, pretending it was just another job. Once the letter was ready, Calvin stood up, feeling like he was walking into the unknown. His hands still shook as he left his apartment and made his way to the mailbox. He dropped the letter in, watching it disappear behind the flap. As he walked away, Calvin knew he had crossed a line, one that he couldn't take back. But he also knew that Detective Harper was smart and she would figure things out. He just hoped she would get to the truth before it was too late. Detective Diana Harper sat in her office, the late afternoon light spilling through the windows. She was surrounded by piles of notes and case files, but her mind was focused on one thing, Jeremy Halburn. The more she dug into the Halburn family, the clearer it became that Oliver's death wasn't as simple as an accident. There was something deeper going on, and Jeremy was at the center of it all. Harper had received the anonymous letter, the one that had shaken her to her core. The letter had been short, but it had told her everything she needed to know. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, and there was a sense of urgency in the words that suggested the writer was conflicted, maybe even scared. Whoever had written it knew the truth about what had happened to Oliver, and they wanted Harper to find it. Her first step was to look into Jeremy. She had already spoken to Nadia, but it was clear to Harper that Nadia didn't know the whole story. The way Nadia had reacted during their interview, avoiding certain questions, her nervous body language, only deepened Harper's suspicion. It was time to focus on Jeremy. Harper dug through the records, going over Jeremy's financials, his phone logs, and his relationship with his father. What she found was disturbing. There were unusual withdrawals from Jeremy's bank account around the time of Oliver's death, and his phone record showed several calls to Calvin Ross, the private investigator who had followed Nadia. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Harper sat back in her chair, letting the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The more she thought about it, the more the picture became clear. Jeremy had hired Calvin to follow Nadia, yes, but there was more to it. Jeremy had been orchestrating everything from the surveillance to Oliver's death. It wasn't just a revenge plot, it was a cold, calculated move to regain control of his life. Harper's mind raced as she thought about her next steps. She needed more evidence, something concrete that could link Jeremy directly to Oliver's death. She was getting closer, but there were still pieces missing. The letter had been a good start, but now she needed to confront Jeremy. And this time, she would be ready. Harper picked up the phone and dialed her partner. "I need everything on Jeremy Halburn," she said as soon as the call was answered. "His financials, his phone records, anything that can link him to his father's death. I'm closing in on him." She hung up, a feeling of certainty settling over her. She was on the right track, and the truth was within reach. It wouldn't be long before Jeremy's lies came crashing down. The morning air was crisp as Detective Diana Harper and her team stood outside the Halburn home. They had the evidence they needed, the financial records, the phone logs, and the anonymous tip that had led them to this moment. Harper was ready. Today, Jeremy Halburn's carefully constructed life was about to unravel. Harper knocked firmly on the door. The seconds felt like minutes as they waited. Finally, the door creaked open and there stood Jeremy. His face was calm, almost too calm, his suit as crisp as ever. He didn't seem surprised to see Harper, but there was a flicker of something, fear maybe, behind his eyes that he quickly hid. "Detective Harper," Jeremy said, his voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Harper didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk about your father's death, Mr. Halburn." Jeremy's expression didn't change. "I already told you everything I know. It was a tragic accident." Harper stepped inside, her eyes scanning the home. The walls were lined with family portraits, the place meticulously organized, just like Jeremy. "You're right about one thing," Harper said, her voice low. "Oliver's death was tragic, but it wasn't an accident, and I think you know that." Jeremy's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He simply stood there, waiting. "I've been looking into your finances, Jeremy," Harper continued. "I've seen the withdrawals, the phone calls to Calvin Ross, the private investigator you hired to follow your wife. I know you've been lying, and I know what you did." Jeremy's eyes flickered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but there was a shift. The calm facade he had worked so hard to build was starting to crack. Harper stepped closer, her voice steady but firm. "You paid Calvin to make sure your father died. You planned it all. You wanted to regain control, to make sure that everything remained just the way you wanted it. But you were wrong to think you could get away with it." Jeremy's face paled, and for the first time his composure wavered. "I didn't," he started, but Harper cut him off. "You knew what you were doing, Jeremy. You thought you were being smart, hiding the truth, but you didn't count on me. And now, you're going to pay for what you did." The silence between them stretched out as Jeremy's mind raced. He could feel the walls closing in. He knew he had lost, but part of him still fought the truth. He wanted to argue, to explain, to make it all go away. But Harper had everything she needed. There was nowhere left to run. Jeremy let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as the truth finally settled on him. He stared at the floor, his words barely audible. It had to be done. He betrayed me. He stole from me, from my family. I had to fix it." Harper nodded, her face hard. "You could have confronted him, but instead you chose murder. And now, you'll have to face the consequences of that choice." Harper motioned to her team, and they stepped forward, carefully placing Jeremy's hands behind his back. "You're under arrest for the murder of Oliver Halburn," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "You have the right to remain silent." Jeremy didn't resist. His body went limp as he was led out of the house, the reality of what he had done sinking in. He was no longer the man in control. His carefully built world had collapsed, and he was now just another man, facing the consequences of his actions. As the door closed behind them, Harper stood in the entryway, watching them leave. She had done it. The truth had come to light, and justice would be served. But even as she felt the satisfaction of solving the case, she couldn't help but wonder about the dark places that lay beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. A few months had passed since Jeremy Halpern's arrest. The news had shocked the neighborhood. Highland Oaks, once a place of respectability, was now whispered about in hushed tones, the Halburn family's name forever linked to betrayal and murder. Nadia had left the house, sold the property, and moved to a small town far from the memories of her past life. She stayed quiet, trying to rebuild her life away from the scandal that had shaken everything she knew. But the weight of what had happened never left her. She thought about Oliver every day, the affair, the lies, and the betrayal. She couldn't escape it. Even now, she struggled to understand how it had all gone so wrong. The guilt lingered, and there were days when the loneliness felt unbearable. But she had no one to blame but herself. In her new town, Nadia kept to herself, working at a small cafe, and living quietly. It was as if she had erased herself from the world she once knew. But no matter how far she went, the memory of the Halburn house, the dark secrets, and the broken family stayed with her. The choices she made haunted her, and she could never escape them. Calvin, meanwhile, had tried to put everything behind him, but it wasn't that easy. After his anonymous tip to Detective Harper, his guilt had only deepened. The memory of Oliver's fall, the look in his eyes before it happened, and the cold realization that he had been part of the plan, it all weighed heavily on him. Calvin distanced himself from his usual work, unable to shake the feeling that he had crossed a line he could never come back from. He knew he would never feel the same again. The money had seemed worth it at the time, but now it felt like a curse he couldn't escape. Calvin stayed out of the spotlight, trying to move on with his life, but the shadow of his involvement in Oliver's death followed him wherever he went. Sometimes he'd see a familiar face from his past work, and the guilt would resurface, reminding him of the choice he had made. There was no going back now. Detective Harper had closed the case, but the memory of it lingered in her mind. It had been a difficult one, filled with lies, betrayals, and dark family secrets, but it was the kind of case she had always been drawn to. The investigation had shown her just how far people would go to protect themselves, to maintain the illusion of a perfect life. Jeremy's cold, calculated actions were a reminder that beneath the surface, everyone had something to hide. Harper knew the Halburn case wouldn't be the last of its kind. People were always hiding something, always running from their secrets. But this case stayed with her, a constant reminder of the complexity of human nature and how even the most respected families could fall apart when the truth came out. As Harper sat at her desk one evening, finishing up her reports, she thought about the Halburns one last time. She'd done her job, but the case had left her with more questions than answers. The truth had come out, but at what cost? What had been left behind? If you're intrigued by this case and want to dive deeper into stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It helps you stay updated whenever we release a new true crime tale. And if you're already subscribed, give this video a thumbs up to let us know you want more chilling mysteries like this. Your support helps us continue bringing you the stories that need to be told.